I built a cybersecurity business. I started in 2014. I sold it in 2020 to a publicly traded company. Most people don't know about cybersecurity, and I think that's the biggest challenge in MedTech.
Cybersecurity, even though it's been around, for well over a decade, it's really become more of a new thing where it's become like a standard in the last few years.
We found 4,000 vulnerabilities that have to be fixed. Software developers are very good at building things, but they don't understand cybersecurity. It's not required to make the device work, but it's required to make sure somebody can't hack into the device. I can kill somebody if I hack into a medical device.
You can't replace part of the brain.
You treat them the same.
Source of truth for the MedTech industry.
Coexists with the products.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the MedTech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the $90 billion company. They had held up high, a lot of things.
The State of MedTech with your host, Omar M. Khatib.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the State of MedTech. We're coming to you from, of course, my favorite conference in the world, the LSI USA Summit here in beautiful Dana Point. I'm joined today by a very special guest. For the longest time, I worked in robotics and AI, but, cybersecurity really became more and more important in the last few years. Not a lot of companies focus on it. There's a lot of big cybersecurity companies out there. I was fortunate enough to come across this really interesting group called Blue Goat Cyber and got to know the founder and CEO, Christian Espinosa, who joins us today. There's a really fascinating story. In my opinion, one of my favorite stories about how he started his second company, specifically in MedTech. And more importantly, we're going to cover a lot of topics in cybersecurity. So Christian, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Omar. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think a good place to start is, we had you and I had a Zoom call like a few weeks ago, and you told me your story about how you started Blue Goat. So, kind of take us to the very end of your last cybersecurity company when it was acquired, and then what happened prior to you deciding to start Blue Goat?
I built a cybersecurity business. I started in 2014. I sold it in 2020 to a publicly traded company. We did MedTech cybersecurity as part of that business, but it wasn't the focus. So I've got 10 years plus experience with MedTech cybersecurity. When I sold that business to the parent company, while I was working for the parent company, I developed 6 blood clots in my left leg and almost didn't make it. So thanks to a friend who told me to go to the hospital, and thanks to a medical device, a portable Doppler ultrasound, they were able to quickly diagnose the clots. So after blood thinners, depression, because I couldn't do anything I used to do, I decided maybe this is the universe telling me to focus on MedTech cybersecurity, because if it wasn't for a medical device, I wouldn't be here. Because I often think, what if that device was recalled or it gave a misdiagnosis? Then, like I said, I wouldn't be here. So I decided to spin off Blue Goat Cyber and take the MedTech cybersecurity portion away from the focus purely on MedTech cybersecurity.
That's amazing. And what I find really inspiring is that, like, in cybersecurity, there's so many different areas you could have gone in that you can call her like huge growth areas, huge contracts, everything. MedTech is really, really difficult, no matter which you are, cybersecurity or marketing. But that didn't stop you from starting that. So when you decided to start the company, what were some of the guiding principles that you had in mind?
Some of the guiding principles I have in mind is, as an entrepreneur, I like helping other entrepreneurs. And one of the things I find compelling about this industry is there's very passionate people that have an idea that may be directly related to someone they know that has a ailment or them themselves, and they wanted to bring this to market. So it resonates with me a lot to work with these innovators to help them bring their product to market. Even though I'm doing it through a cybersecurity lens, I am very passionate about the entrepreneurship side of it as well. So if I can help in that regard as part of our cybersecurity service, if there's a way for me to help with the entrepreneur journey, because I've been doing entrepreneurship for a while, I like to do that too. So it's like another passion for me.
When, the average person, even I say average person in MedTech thinks about cybersecurity, I think a lot of people, they think of it as when something is getting attacked, but there's different forms of cybersecurity, correct?
Correct. Most people don't know what they don't know about cybersecurity. And I think that's the biggest challenge in MedTech. People just simply don't know. They don't think about it until the very end, right before they're trying to get their device approved by the FDA or MDR. And then their regulatory affairs person's like, oh, cybersecurity is on the checklist of documents we have to submit. And by that time, it's too late, because that's typically when they engage my company. and we find like thousands of things wrong, and they cannot fix it in 2 months. So it delays their time to market. It causes frustration with the innovator, the investors, and everyone else. And it's really costly. So it's one of those things that, from my perspective, one of the initiatives that my company has is really to raise the awareness about the importance of cybersecurity early on in a product's life cycle.
And that was one of the reasons why I reached out to you, and I really was impressed because I saw that you've written a few books on cybersecurity, but you also put out a lot of content, go on podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like is that your company really took an educational approach to this really important topic. And the reason why, for me, it's so important, this is why I wanted to have you on the show and also work with you guys more, is that cybersecurity isn't part of normal conversation for most MedTech founders.
Right.
They're used to talking about quality regulatory, some commercial stuff, clinical trials and everything. So cybersecurity, even though it's been around, for well over a decade, it's really become more of a new thing where it's become like a standard in the last few years. But unfortunately, as a result of that, it's almost like not an afterthought, but it's like, again, the very last thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it feels like that could be almost like a death sentence for a company, because you could be ready to go, but in reality, your cybersecurity stuff is off, and now you're delayed 3, 6, 9 months sometimes.
Right. Yeah, it's the silent killer, as I like to say, because people don't think about it. And as example, we have one client that came to us 60 days before submission. We found 4,000 vulnerabilities that have to be fixed. Otherwise, there'll be effect to the patient safety. And it's been 10 months since we first discovered those vulnerabilities, and they still haven't fixed them. So at this point, they're just going to try to submit anyway and hope that the FDA, in this case, approves their 510K, but we already know the FDA is going to reject it. But they're kind of out of money and out of options. So this could have all been prevented if they would have just had 10 hours of our consulting time at the very beginning. We could have guided them by making better design decisions, helping them develop secure code, and a lot of other things that are often neglected.
Yeah, and I think, I do see that you guys are very good at, which is you have a very, very good team that can work very fast. But I think the most important thing is that these things take time. And I think the other side of it, in terms of managing the product, we want to do this concurrently with your standards that you're trying to achieve in cybersecurity. Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
I think the challenge is that's the correct way of thinking about it. I think the challenge is people think from a timeline perspective. If I've got my roadmap for my product, my biocompatibility study may take 2 months. So they put a 2-month time block on the calendar on that roadmap. And then I think they think the same thing with cybersecurity. We'll put a 2-month block on the calendar, but the reality is cybersecurity needs to be an iterative process, because you wait till the very end at that 2-month period and then do cybersecurity, all the things you did before when you're developing your product and your software and your firmware probably didn't have cybersecurity. So all those things have to be revisited, which is what causes that delay.
Between those 3 areas, and actually, I know what you're talking about, but I would love for you to break it down for the audience. When you think about software, firmware, and hardware, I think software and hardware, the audience does know, but can you tell us more, like what exactly is firmware? And between those 3 things, where do you see the most vulnerabilities on average for cybersecurity?
For firmware, as example, we had a client that was developing a bronchial decongestion system, and they were doing their own firmware on a microcontroller. They contacted us 60 months before the submission, but they made a design choice like several years prior about a specific microcontroller, which is a piece of hardware. That microcontroller did not support secure boot, which is now a requirement of the FDA. So what ended up happening from a firmware security perspective, they had to basically make their device stand alone because it was too risky to have it connected to anything. So they originally were going to have it connected via cellular to a cloud and have a patient portal and a physician portal and all that stuff. That all had to go away. So it basically became a standalone. It did become a standalone device. So that was a vulnerability in firmware. Traditionally, we see vulnerabilities in software. From my experience, software developers are very good at building things, but they don't understand cybersecurity. My team is very good at breaking things. We look at every angle a attacker would take to break into the device, every interface into the device. It could be Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, the touch screen, a keyboard, a USB port, HDMI port, just every entry point in the device. We look at that and try to penetrate through the entry point, and then from there see where else we can go. And the bottom line is, if we can affect the device in a manner that translates to affecting patient health or causing harm to a patient or a misdiagnosis or a delayed diagnosis, then that needs to be fixed.
You look at like companies like this, for example, right? You mentioned both firmware and software. You also mentioned hardware. What are the cybersecurity threats that like hardware could come across? Because I think this is a problem is that there's a lot of med device companies that think like, oh yeah, like we're not like techie of a company, so we don't really need much cybersecurity, when maybe they are.
Yeah, good question. I neglected to answer the hardware part. With a medical device, if there is an interface that's exposed, let's say it's a USB port, and you do not need the interface for the device to operate properly, it should be covered up. So from a hardware perspective, there should be a cover around it, so somebody can't physically connect to that device. And some clients will have a cover that just is magnetically closes. That's not sufficient. So from a design perspective, you need to consider what kind of enclosure do we need. If we don't need access to these ports on the device, maybe we should create an enclosure to cover them up. And that removes the whole entry point in the system, because somebody has to destroy the device in order to get into those ports, which at that point, through your labeling, if the device looks like it's destroyed or all the tamper-proof seals are torn off of it, you would label it for the user not to, consider it compromised.
Something else that I was thinking, for State of MedTech, we've had more companies come on who are in the BCI, or brain computer interface world. When I think of like a cybersecurity attack, I feel like the first thing that comes to mind is like BCI and cardiac. But like, if you're kind of to list like these are the type of companies that definitely they have very rigorous cybersecurity requirements by the FDA, like what kind of companies come to mind other than, let's say, BCI and let's say an implantable?
IVD, in vitro diagnostics, is a big one. And there's a risk very high with that, because if you are taking a sample of tissue and run it through the system to determine if somebody has sepsis, as an example, and the device is compromised and there's a delay, the patient could die because your blood is toxic with sepsis. So IVD is a big one. Surgical robots, of course. If you can compromise a surgical robot while it's performing surgery, now it can do whatever the attacker wants it to do. Implantables, you mentioned that. Those are a major risk. A lot of people don't think about implantables. I know Dick Cheney, it was some time ago, but there was legitimate threat where somebody could wirelessly connect to his defibrillator and shock him to death. And these things are real. Not a lot of them have been realized, but there's a reason he had that wireless feature of his pacemaker and defibrillator disabled. So some of it, if it's like a direct attack where I'm trying to attack somebody specifically, I think a lot of people just consider that. But the reality is most of the attacks that happen against medical devices are what I call non-directed attacks, because a medical device gets installed on a healthcare delivery organization's environment, which we consider a hostile environment. That environment is not friendly. You can expect that device to be attacked over and over and over as soon as it's plugged into the environment.
Why is that?
It's that way because hospitals are notorious for not securing their networks. I mean, if you just look at the news, pretty much every hospital has been compromised. Just when you think there can't be a bigger data breach of a hospital, the next day you read in the news there's been a bigger one, right? It's kind of crazy. But those hospital networks, the medical devices are on those same networks that have been data breached.
When these breaches happen, aside from like data, let's say with like devices and everything, are these bad actors that are looking to get paid out? Like we have this, do this, or else. Like what walk us through what a scenario like that looks like.
So these cyber criminals are out to make money. They're just like you and I, but they do it in nefarious manners. They're not the good guys; they're the bad guys. But they're out there to make money. And the way they typically make money is ransomware. That's the main method. So I hack all your systems, I hold them hostage until you pay me ransom. What happens is they are just scanning incessantly for vulnerable systems to compromise. And inadvertently, a medical device is going to get scanned, and it might be somebody might install ransomware on it, or that device, if it has a vulnerability, and we have to look at this as a larger picture. If a medical device has a vulnerability and the cyber criminal attacks it, from there, they can establish what's called a beachhead and then attack other devices or other networks. So it's like an entry point into an environment that might be weak, and some people would say is a trusted device, but it's really not trusted. That's why we have this thing called zero trust in cybersecurity. They could pivot from there and attack other things, but ultimately make money, typically through ransomware.
I was under the misconception that like cyber criminals, they'll find a target and say like, yeah, we're gonna go after a bank, we're in a hospital. But you're saying that it doesn't really matter. They're essentially scanning somehow and trying to find some vulnerability, some backdoor, something that was open, and use that as a beachhead to launch other things. So
to scan other things, yes.
Scanning, they might find like, let's say, a BCI or a digital implant or something and say, oh, like, here's the things that's compromised. And then they think of a way to essentially create ransomware on that and then use that as a beachhead to other devices similar to it.
Yeah, once they find a vulnerability, ransomware is just the payload that's delivered. They can deliver whatever payload they want to. But yeah, and we've done experiments with this. So we stand up a web server on Amazon, for instance, within like 3 minutes, it's been scanned like 1,000 times by people trying to break into it. That's how much activity is going on. And it's kind of unseen because it's digital. But yeah, the activity is, it's immense. I don't think people really realize how much attackers are trying to get into thing on a nanosecond by nanosecond basis, really.
Interesting. And, not to get controversial, but I can't help it, but, especially these days, in the new era now, like we're kind of moving away from like hot wars, where people are like literally physically fighting to death and everything. And I think more of like cyber attacks and stuff. And so we see that a lot through countries. Is that something that also comes into play here, at least on the healthcare side?
100%. Imagine if one of our adversaries has implanted themselves in all of our healthcare environments, and then we get into a dispute with them, they push a button, and our whole healthcare system goes down, including our medical devices. Yeah, that's the reality.
Has something like that ever like happened before, or you come close to happening? Like whether it's
happened with electrical grids, the industrial control systems, like the Northeast Power Grid. It's happened with a lot of oil pipelines. It's happened with a lot of things. It hasn't necessarily happened on a global scale in healthcare. I feel like when the time comes, though, and the enemy wants to do something like that, they probably already have a foothold. And it's not just that. It's like, what we have to consider, like, it's not just the hot wars you mentioned, right? Or this like digital war. It's a combination. Like if I'm going to send troops into an enemy territory, but I can take out their electrical grid and take out their radar system so they can't see my planes flying over, then it helps me with a kinetic war as well. So if I'm going to attack a country, but I can take out their healthcare system, or at least disable it for a while, that's a distraction, and then I can do something else, whether caught off guard, dealing with that. I know we're getting a little bit more into cyber war, but I used to do a lot of stuff with the DoD. So
no, I think it's good, because I don't think that healthcare, it's kind of like, if you look at it on the economic side, everything has been sort of, I don't want to say conquered, but this is why, like on the economic side, a lot of companies like Apple, Microsoft, etc., are moving to healthcare. On the cybersecurity side, I feel like there's all these other areas that have been notorious for cyber attacks and everything. And healthcare is still there as a sort of new area where there's a lot of companies that don't realize how compromised that they are, and how much more rigorous their cybersecurity measures needs to be.
Yeah. It's like the new frontier, but it's also the old frontier. I think people don't understand that medical device could be compromised. They just trust these devices historically. And now there's been enough compromises and recalls where people have lost as much trust. Even hospitals now, which I mentioned are hostile, they're trying to get better. They are putting a lot of pressure on medical device manufacturers that are, let's say, already FDA cleared, to prove that they've done more than just the minimum before that device can enter their hospital environment. So it's something we are slowly getting the awareness around, but it's been slow, and we're way behind.
So if you're speaking of, a lot of our audience are founders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as a founder, you're dealing with your clinical trials, you're raising money, all these different things, right? So there's like one other thing they have to think about. My thing is like you might as well. It's actually look. Cybersecurity is a lot more complicated in my opinion than marketing. But even with something like marketing or sales, it's better to start early when you have time and you can ease into it.
Yeah.
Because the costs are actually a lot less at that point as well.
Mhm.
So if you're speaking to a founder, regardless of what kind of device they have, at what point should they start like not only thinking about cybersecurity but like actually engaging a group like Blue Goat?
When they are developing the requirements for their device.
That early.
Yeah, because when we develop requirements, there's functional requirements, which is to make the device work properly, but there's also non-functional requirements. Cybersecurity typically falls under the umbrella of non-functional requirements. It's not required to make the device work, but it's required to make sure somebody can't hack into the device. So at the requirements phase is where they should be looking at cybersecurity. And then if it's the requirements phase is done properly, then it enters the design phase and the controls are designed into the device.
And this is, I want to emphasize this, and correct me if I'm wrong, this needs to be thought of completely separate, because I think the other issue is that a lot of founders, they group cybersecurity in with like, oh, either we have somebody consulting or we have somebody in-house who does like regulatory for us and quality management. This is a completely different thing.
Yes, a lot of people try to say they do cybersecurity, like they add it to like a list of services, but they're not really doing cybersecurity.
Right.
So I think it's important to engage with a firm like mine that understands MedTech specific cybersecurity, because with cybersecurity, I like to think MedTech is like a PhD level. Traditional cybersecurity to me is like high school. Like the complexity is so much more, the regulatory landscape, the types of devices, the AI that's enabled, it's a lot more complex, and there's a lot more pressure because it's not just information disclosure. I can kill somebody if I hack into a medical device. So the impact is a lot greater and the risk is a lot greater. So you really need to hire someone that knows what they're doing, not someone that just took a cybersecurity course and is trying to help you with cybersecurity, which is what often happens.
And I'm glad you mentioned, because like now with a lot of these companies, a lot of companies are realizing that in order for them to just have large evaluations, attract investors with larger checkbooks, they have to digitize and include things that are data related. A lot of companies are trying to figure out ways how to essentially incorporate and use AI. And so that just adds a whole nother layer of complexity. How much more complex does it become when a company, let's say their main product is not an AI product, but they have some version of AI ML integrated in?
It becomes way more complex because AI has its own set of ways to attack from a cybersecurity perspective, like model invasion, where we can evade the model, we can do data poisoning. So as soon as you add AI to a device, there's like this whole landscape of ways somebody can attack the device in a nefarious manner that opens up. So we have to make sure that model is trained properly, is protected properly, and all the controls exist around that as well.
You said something very interesting, data poisoning. What is data poisoning?
Data poisoning is where I feed the AI model a bunch of malicious data in order for it to spit out a malicious result.
Interesting. Does that also come into play, like, one of the issues, we never foresaw this happening until AI came about, which is like AI's having, the model's having hallucinations. Is that another thing, like you can introduce data poisoning to cause hallucinations with the AI to give,
That's a problem with AI in general. I mean, humans created AI to be like humans, and you rarely can get a human to say, I don't know. So we're expecting, and this is becoming a bigger issue with MedTech. If we have AI that's trying to give a diagnosis, can we train the AI to say, I don't know the answer? Or will it come up with an answer, which is like the hallucination you're coming up with? It'll just make something up the best it can because that's what it was taught to do. So that's a whole other challenge for sure.
What about, one of the things that I did notice is that with a lot of these digital devices, whether I think like, insulin devices is one example, or continuous glucose monitors, but a lot of these devices, they don't just operate on their own digital mode. They have connectivity with other devices, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, I would imagine that adds another layer of complexity and vulnerabilities when it comes to cybersecurity.
100%. That's considered the interoperability cybersecurity portion. So if I have a let's say a system that is imaging and it connects to a PACS server. Now we have to consider, is the data we are getting from that PACS server, how do we know it has integrity? How do we know it hasn't been altered? And then the data we're sending back, how does that device know that the data hasn't been altered? So we have to look at the data coming in and make sure it's trustworthy, as well as data coming out, because we have to play nicely in this ecosystem where we're talking with other devices. And the problem is, if someone doesn't play nicely, now you could ingest or send malicious data, not maybe malicious, but data that's malformatted or has a problem to a device that's then used to do some sort of analysis on the data. So we have to basically trust that device, but verify the data as we get it. As Reagan said, trust but verify. I'm a big fan of that.
Got it. And Christian, just as we round things out again, thanks for spending some time with us. For the founders who are listening, if you can kind of give them their next steps of, the big thing about our show is that people get a lot of education, definitely a lot of entertainment. More specifically, like, what are they going to do when they finish listening to this episode? Like, give us some steps of action they can take, aside from, of course, engaging you guys at Blue Goat. But what should they be doing next? What should they be thinking about? And what can they expect on a timeline?
I think a good next step is to actually look at the product and the roadmap and the requirements and see if anybody's even thought about cybersecurity. Of course, they can call us and have a consult, but just going through the exercise, like, have we actually thought about cybersecurity at all, especially if our device has any software component to it? And the answer is typically no, but I'm hoping that we can increase that awareness so people start asking that question earlier on. If the answer is no, then they can take the next step or figure out how to get cybersecurity on the roadmap. And that may not be contacting my company, it may be hiring somebody else, but I'm a big advocate of, like, solving that problem of you don't know what you don't know. So now you do know what you don't know, and now you can do something about it.
Very sensible. Christian, thank you so much for coming on the show. And for those who are listening, let's say they're on the road, where can they learn more about Blue Goat?
They can go to bluegoatcyber.com. We're also on LinkedIn and pretty much all social media.
Yeah, I found you guys on Instagram.
On Instagram.
I slid into the DMs and here we are.
That's all right. That's how we met.
Absolutely.
On IG, yeah.
Exactly. Well, Christian, thank you so much for joining the show. And I want to thank the audience for listening. Again, go to bluegoatcyber.com to learn more. And as always, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who would really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.